Um, so, my name's Arnie Saiki. I'm the director and blogger of Imipono Projects and have been one of the coordinators for this conference. Let me first say I'm honored to be here with this group of experts on trade. I do not share the expertise of peoples like Michelle, Arthur, Jim, Victor, and Maureen, but I do think that we all share a conviction that these new trade cooperations, rather new free trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are not only an assault to our sovereignty, but also a black boot to our peoples and our biodiversity, as Michelle mentioned. If we measured the revenues or assets of corporations alongside the GDP of nations, more than 50% of the 100 biggest economies on Earth would be corporations. And the TPP negotiators are meeting secretly and being advised by 600 lobbyists of the largest corporations. I'm pretty sure that we would mostly want to know what the specific details of those negotiations are. And by we, I mean the 99%, those who are most likely to be impacted by those negotiators. US-led free trade agreements like the TPP represent corporate stakeholders, shareholders, investors, but what I want to talk about today is what about the proper rights holders? Peoples, public citizens, workers, animals, plants, the entire biodiversity of our forests, deserts, and oceans have a right to consent to decisions impacting our world. Greed-driven policies are being determined without the free, prior, and informed consent of the proper rights holders. So exponentially, more than 99.99% of the planet's rights holders should have that right. And we know about the biodiversity of this planet to know that extinction does not equal consent. So if we are not given free, prior, and informed consent over decisions impacting our lives and commons, how do we move forward with decisions that allow us to steward our communities and environments? This question should not only be addressed to TPP negotiators, as this is a fundamental question that should be posed to the trade regime in its entirety, but I would argue that the TPP is the most aggressive because of its size and because of its investment process. There are alternative or competing trade cooperations like the China-led RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was launched last year at ASEAN. China practices more attractive investment procedures called soft loans, and these soft loans are state-owned infrastructure loans that are generally more attractive to developing economies than loans provided by the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank, which is why many Pacific Islands and developing economies prefer working with China rather than US Wall Street. Soft loans do not require the same structured repayment and that investment banks require and have the trade liberalizing conditions demanded by development banks. And additionally, I think it's important to note that none of the BRICS economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are included in the TPP. And so when we talk about TPP, we may want to consider that they are competing fundamental policies reminiscent of, or perhaps inherited from Cold War policies that bind not only nations but economies to trade cooperations. PICTA and PACER Plus, as Maureen, PICTA being the Pacific Island countries trade agreement, as Maureen described, are binding Pacific Island small island states to outdated neoliberal policies. And then there are other regional or bilateral investor state agreements, which, if the US is involved, follows the same neoliberal investor state protocols. Walmart VP Angela Hoffman, expressing her participation in the TPP before the Committees on Ways and Means, writes, "We have realized that gaps and complications in the supply chain unnecessarily hinder our ability to deliver the right product at the right price to our customers around the world." Her testimony that agreements are being drawn for the benefit of the global supply chain or for Walmartization are parroted by other corporate and fund managers. In the Forbes Global 500, Walmart stands head and shoulders above everyone else. But going back to the TPP, beyond this lack of free, prior, and informed consent, the TPP and all other US-led investor state agreements are codified in binding international law. Although this entire acronym soup of trade cooperations may be daunting to some, What we are in essence talking about are investor-state agreements and a new paradigm of legal rights to investors or corporate shareholders that are motivated by the sheer financial and economic strength of this $27 trillion economy if we were to measure these GDP economies through GDP. So, for example, earlier this month, Samoa was the first Pacific Small Island state to sign PICTA, the Pacific Island Countries Trade Agreement Trade and Services Protocol. One of the chapters is a Financial Services Index annex, and it reveals that Samoa has just inherited the kind of unregulated, over-the-counter, derivative risk investment services that led to the crippling of many lower and middle-income communities here in the U.S. Since the crash, however, the U.S. has initiated regulatory roles via the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, but for small Pacific Island countries whose GDP may be around $500 million annually, there is no Dodd-Frank. There's only this investment service that Samoa is now legally bound to. But perhaps I speak too soon, as House Republicans are now trying to use trade deals like the TPP and the new Atlantic version, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, as a vehicle to sidestep these Dodd-Frank regulations. In the event of disputes, Samoa, as well as other Pacific Island countries who are considering ratifying this agreement, they may hardly even be able to pay the legal fees to settle disputes without bankrupting their economy. So who benefits most from these agreements are investors and corporations representing agriculture, fisheries, biotech, mining, banking or insurance sectors, etc. And the Pacific Plan is opening the floodgates for large banks and hedge funds to sell these mortgage-related or futures-related investment schemes that are designed to fail so that hedge funds can collect on the insurance of that failure. Because the Pacific region is one of the most isolated and resource-rich regions, creating terms of trade that maximize the investment and trade regime will eventually leave a lot of Pacific peoples bankrupt. And when you account for the TPP, which Australia and New Zealand also belong to, island communities will be left stranded without a paddle, just as a storm cloud of impending doom hovers over the horizon. I think for many of the Pacific Small Island states, they view PICTA as a kind of standalone integration scheme, like a mini EU, but the reality is that with the TPP looming in the distance, PICTA by default will be consumed by the surrounding 12-nation, $26 trillion trade cooperation. Now, sometimes I feel like I have to apologize because when we describe the impact of free trade agreements or investment agreements, we talk about it as a warning, as we've done, or as a cautionary tale, as if we were those three witches in Macbeth, the ones who are always in this storm cloud representing chaos, conflict, and darkness. As these ever-watchful witch figures, we're acting as witnesses, as agents that prophesy and send out warnings of impending doom. Yet this is where we are today. We are talking about impending doom. We are talking about our lives continually having to adjust from one crisis to the next, fighting over our customary lands and resources, having traditional communities and family structures torn apart by greed, while up ahead we see that the impact of global warming and man-made climate change is the endgame to life on the planet as we know it. And it's difficult to convey this because the sun rises and the birds sing, but when you step back and you view this through a history filter, we are living in a very strange and dark time. And it is our collective strength, however, our unity and activism, that provides optimism and sunlight in these times, and we find ourselves here because we believe it is what is right and what is pono. And so what gets me is that Wall Street, the investment regime, continues to prioritize extractive and depleting industries and resource privatization and developed a whole new financial mechanism that profits off catastrophe. New investment products called cat bonds that transfers the risks from insurance companies to investors, which technically are part of the reinsurance market. Catastrophe bonds are another derivatives product, another product derived from some tradable good or service, and it works like this. If there's no disaster by the end of whatever term, investors get a return on their investments. In the event of a disaster, however, insurance companies pay the claim holders while investors lose their upfront investment. It seems straightforward enough. The caveat, however, is that only large investor corporations like Monsanto, Walmart, and those 600 corporate advisors to the TPP can purchase these. Many of these 600 heavyweight corporations are investing in the Pacific, as are mining and energy or other extractive industries that rely upon the leasing or privatization of resources. So to illustrate, there are research and development costs, there are the building of security and infrastructure, and all of these is what attracts investors. Sometimes these infrastructure costs are paid for through development loans given to governments by international development banks like the ADB or the World Bank. More often now, we see that investments are being driven by public-private enterprises through the selling, leasing, or the privatization of public resources. In terms of security, there may be some partnerships with private militaries, but mostly we're talking about militaries that have a parking space and commute to and from Pearl Harbor. And so one of the ways that this new paradigm shift in investment is impacting financial services is that hedge funds, for example, are looking for development opportunities to privatize more resources. The loss of these resources is a loss of anticipated future profits, and whatever these anticipated future profits are can easily be accounted for through the investment of these catastrophe bonds. And large hedge fund managers have capitalized very, very heavily on these cat bonds when disasters occur. So in this new profit-driving reinsurance scheme, catastrophes and severe weather have become financial assets to investors because they can drive this narrative of fear to sell their trade investments and services to Pacific Island countries which are very susceptible to severe weather and climate change to the point where islands are literally sinking. But what I think is really important to address here now is the Pacific Plan, and I'll quickly go through this. So by way of history, the Pacific Plan is a Pacific Island economic integration proposal that was initiated by the Pacific Island Forum in 2005. Fundamentally, the Pacific Plan asserts trade liberalization across the region, and it was drafted and led by the big brother economies of Australia and New Zealand. A year before the announcements of the Pacific Pivot, which this Moana Nui conference addresses, Assistant Secretary of State Kurt Campbell met with American Samoa Representative Eni Faleomavaegna and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs on new U.S. policy in the Pacific. This new U.S. policy identified working with the Pacific Island Forum and the Pacific Plan, as well as a whole slew of sub-regional institutions, NGOs, and civil society organizations to create greater opportunities and regional investments between Pacific Island countries and the U.S. Now here we are barely 3 years later, and the Pacific Plan is now going through a review process. As part of the review process, the Pacific planners are traveling from island to island, meeting with representatives and trying to determine how best to implement this neoliberal economic package by assessing the needs of each island group. For some governments, the needs may be climate change. For others, it may be infrastructure. For others, like in Palau, they discuss growing the private sector to play a key role in tourism and development, which they identified as a golf course and some five-star hotels. These programs may seem sound if we were still partying as if it were 1999 and the strength of our economies were accounted for in ways that did not have to take into account resource depletion and environmental degradation. But the truth of the matter is the new economic matrix will have to account for degradation and depletion of resources. These 600 largest corporations that are advising TPP negotiators could very well ensure that US-owned assets abroad, either through direct investment or foreign securities, will be accounted for by the corporations and be added to their portfolios, and government economic bureaus will also account for this in their national accounting systems. So, as a recommendation to any Pacific Plan revision process, there should be a moratorium on investor-state agreements until we can better understand what's contained in these TPP negotiations. Just to repeat, there should be a moratorium on these investor-state agreements until we can better understand what's contained in these secret TPP negotiations. As it stands now, the national accounting of resources and the protection of Pacific Island regional biodiversity should be seen as a strength to our national economies and not a commodity. Trade cooperations like the TPP pick the PACER Plus, seek privatization models, and the small Pacific Island states, I wonder if alliances like the Melanesian Spearhead Group might possibly be turning their attention to cooperations like ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas. For the Pacific Islands, economic and political integration has, for the most part, already been co-opted by the larger economic powers. And ecological integration, however, has not, and is open for us to assert, a non-centralized, peoples-led regional monitoring authority that hopefully, potentially, could use free, prior, and informed consent as a way to create some kind of regulatory wedge within these investor-state agreements. So when one looks at the basic framework of these investor-state agreements between corporate investors and governments, clearly it's people and biodiversity that is missing. Thank you.